Hello and welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, hi, you're very welcome. This is Reading the Past and I'm Dr. Cat. And no doubt the title of today's video gives you a bit of an idea what I'm going to be talking about. But to horribly misquote and paraphrase Jane Austen, it is a truth universally acknowledged that Anne of Cleves, Henry VIII's fourth wife, was the, in quotes, ugly one. Is this fair? Is this reductive? Are we really willing to believe that Anne of Cleves's personal appearance, however unpleasant it may or may not have been, was sufficiently displeasing to the king that he would derail months of diplomacy and undo his marriage, his fourth marriage, notably something that would bring about the scorn and derision of all of the other European households because of his much-married status? Is it really as simple as the fact that Anne of Cleves was so personally repugnant to Henry VIII that he could not bear to be in her presence, much less in her bed? Is it really her ugliness that derails their marriage? Well, today I want to look at it. Let's look at the key events that led up to their marriage being made, and arguably put them on the road to it being a complete disaster. Let's talk about it. Anne of Cleves and I share a birthday, albeit one that is, of course, separated by many centuries. Like Anne of Cleves, I was also born on the 22nd of September. However, for Anne of Cleves, the year was 1515. She was born in Düsseldorf, Germany. Her father was Johann or John the Peaceful. Many people have said that Anne of Cleves grew up in a provincial parochial backwater, but it is worth remembering that her father was an enlightened prince of his time. In fact, he was one of the patrons of the great scholar Erasmus. He would die in 1538, 1 year before the marriage negotiations between England and Cleves opened to marry Anne to Henry VIII. Anne was made into a particularly attractive prospective bride for Henry VIII by something that her father chose to do. Johann or John and Henry had both decided to remove their lands from papal authority. Although there is no evidence that either of them actively became Protestant or Lutheran or Calvinist in their own religious outlook, they had separated their nations and lands from papal authority. Therefore, there was parity in the way that these two men attempted to organise and orchestrate the religious identity of their people. In 1527, when Anne of Cleves would have been 11 or 12 years old, she was betrothed for the first time to Francois, the heir to the Duchy of Lorraine. As it would turn out, this betrothal would not result in a marriage, and both people within this partnership were left free to marry elsewhere. This failed betrothal was the first step on the path that would see Anne of Cleves married to Henry VIII of England. For the next step, we need to fast forward a decade and travel from Cleves to England. On the 24th of October, 1537, Henry VIII suffered a personal tragedy. His third wife and mother of his surviving son and heir, Jane Seymour, died at Hampton Court. Her death resulted from complications caused by the birth of that longed-for son and heir. In bringing Henry's son into the world, she had sacrificed her own life. Understandably, perhaps, for Henry, this made her into some sort of maternal superhero, the ideal wife against whom all others would be compared and would ultimately be found wanting. Almost at once there were, it seems, suggestions that Henry might contract a marriage with one of the daughters of Cleves. Anne apparently was suggested. However, if this prospective marriage was indeed being discussed, however tentatively, it seems that Henry heard quite poor reports regarding Anne's looks, and the matter was swiftly dropped. Maybe Henry was concerned that he did not want an ugly bride. I think it's perhaps more likely, at this time, that he is so grief-stricken by Jane's death that any thought of marrying again is the last thing on his mind. Just 2 years later, however, the need for a marriage alliance with a foreign nation became a pressing one for Henry VIII's England, when, at the start of 1539, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V and the French king Francois I, signed the Treaty of Toledo. Together, they made a pact they would make no further treaties with Henry VIII or his England. External support would, it seems, be a welcome relief. The Treaty of Toledo may well have been the inciting incident that placed Henry back on the path to matrimony. Perhaps he was convinced of the need for a foreign match and the treaty and support that such a marriage would bring. Allegedly, at the behest of Thomas Cromwell, Anne of Cleves was raised once again as a potential spouse, and Henry permitted negotiations to begin. Thomas Cromwell had, he said, heard reports of Anne's beauty, counter to the negative opinions that Henry had heard a few years previously. Rather than being unpleasant looking, Thomas Cromwell said that Anne of Cleves' beauty excelled even that of Christina of Milan, a woman who, by all accounts, Henry had been very interested in when he'd seen a picture of her. But Henry VIII wasn't going to take the reports that Thomas Cromwell had apparently heard as the gospel truth. As he had done the year previously with Christina of Milan, he sent once again the court painter Hans Holbein to Cleves to paint this potential new bride. And here is the result of Hans Holbein the Younger's labour. This fantastic portrait of Anne of Cleves. By all accounts, when Henry received it, he was in paroxysms of joy. So much so that on the 4th of October, 1539, so captivated was he by this portrait that Henry confirmed that he would marry Anne, and he signed a treaty to allow the marriage to go ahead. In relation to Anne's appearance, some have said that Holbein's portrait was overly flattering, perhaps even actively deceptive. And I would like to caution this point of view. Is it likely that Holbein would have actively deceived his patron in this way and gone unpunished? How would he have been able to maintain his life in England, his work at court, which certainly did happen after Anne arrived in England, and indeed after the marriage was annulled? I don't think it is likely. And so therefore we must consider that this painting is a fairly accurate representation of the way that Anne of Cleves looked. Looking at this portrait, I certainly do not see an ugly woman. Rather, I would say that she is attractive, if not actually beautiful. But I wonder what you think. Do you think that this portrait is clearly overly kind and somehow Holbein got away with it? Do you think this portrait shows an unattractive woman? Or do you agree with me that what we have in front of us is a fairly accurate depiction of what Anne of Cleves looked like? That Holbein has done the job he was tasked with doing and he has served his patron. And as such, what we see is the beauty that Anne of Cleves actually was. As I said, this portrait was sufficient evidence as far as Henry was concerned that Anne of Cleves was a beautiful woman, fit to be his wife. He was willing to sign a marriage treaty and put the wheels in motion to bring her to England. In late 1539, Anne set off for her new land. Anne of Cleves would not meet her future husband until New Year's Day, 1540. As it turned out, this was to be an ill-fated meeting, which took place at Rochester Castle. Many have argued that the marriage was doomed from this meeting, and I think that in part it's because the greatest cause of confusion, disappointment and problems that emerged from this meeting was caused by the fact that Henry VIII knew it was happening and Anne of Cleves didn't. Anne of Cleves thought that Rochester Castle was a stop on her journey to meet her future husband. But Henry VIII had long been fascinated with the chivalric tradition of disguising and masquerading. He was firm in his belief that even disguised, true lovers would recognise each other for who they really were. As a young man, Henry, arguably one of the most beautiful princes in Christendom, a head taller than all of his courtiers, slim and athletic, would frequently don the clothes of the lower orders. He would dress in homespun and play Robin Hood as a lover. But that wasn't Henry anymore. He was still tall, but this ageing king, through injury and ill health, was now a lot fatter than he used to be. The wound on his leg scarcely healed and frequently smelt very bad. Without his kingly garments, dressed perhaps once again in homespun, the king, disguised, burst in with a group of friends. So the story goes, he went straight up to his bride-to-be and kissed her. Anne of Cleves was apparently horrified, both perhaps by the lack of protocol, a stranger kissing her when she was the future wife of the King of England, and maybe also a bit of personal revulsion at this rather unattractive man pouring at her. Henry was embarrassed, enraged, and ultimately disappointed in what he found. He is said to have burst out of the room, turned to Cromwell and said, "I like her not, I like her not." It would appear that there was no coming back from this. Some have suggested that Henry wasn't just put off by Anne of Cleves' inability to play the game of the English court. Rather, he may also have been dissuaded of her attractiveness because of her difference from his previous wives. Henry's 3 previous wives had been relatively petite women, small-boned, some would describe. Anne of Cleves, what the portrait didn't show, is that she may have been a woman of quite tall stature, big-boned, with strong features. Perhaps this difference was enough to put Henry off in such a profound way. However, it is also worth mentioning that well-known phrase about Anne of Cleves, that she was, quote, a Flanders mare, is never said by Henry. As Tracy Borman has pointed out, this comes from a much later 17th century description of her by Bishop Gilbert Burnet. After this disastrous meeting, Henry VIII was keen to do anything he could to get himself out of the Gordian knot of this marriage. He didn't want to go through with it. Unfortunately for Henry, he had tasked Thomas Cromwell, that arch legal mind, with being involved with drawing up the treaty and the contract. No matter what Henry put forward, it was ironclad. He was going to have to go through with it. And so he did, on the 6th of January 1540. He went complaining, and it seems that the wedding night did not go much better. The next day, on the morning of the 7th of January 1540, he complained of his new bride to Thomas Cromwell, saying that he could not bring himself to consummate his marriage with his new wife because she was smelly, fat, and had had sex before. I rather like Susanna Lipscomb's analysis of this, in which she says, in that bed that night, there certainly was one person who was smelly, fat, and not a virgin, but it almost certainly wasn't Anne of Cleves. Many people assert a conversation that Anne of Cleves was said to have had with her ladies not long after her marriage as proof of her virginity and actually her lack of knowledge about anything sexual. In conversation with her ladies, she talked about how her husband, Henry VIII, would come to bed with her. He would kiss her and say, "Good night, sweetheart." And the next morning he would kiss her again and say, "Good morning, darling." She asked, "Is this not enough?" Upon hearing this from their new queen, one of her ladies rather saucily responded that there would need to be more than that, or else it would be a very long time before they welcomed a Duke of York, which all the nation so heartily desired. What we can say for sure about Henry VIII is that he is frequently very good at turning feelings into facts and at getting what he wants. And what he wants at this present time is for the recognition that his marriage to Anne of Cleves is invalid. It has not been consummated and it won't be consummated. He ensures that his doctor, Dr. Butts, tells the world that he is perfectly capable of having sex, that he has had nocturnal emissions or wet dreams. The problem isn't with him, of course, it's with Anne of Cleves. Matters only get worse because after spring 1540, Henry has got his eyes set on somebody else. One of his wife's ladies in waiting. Doesn't that sound familiar? This time it is the young, nubile Catherine Howard. Anne's days as queen are numbered. On the 24th of June 1540, Anne of Cleves was banished from court. She was sent away from her husband's side and ordered to remain at Richmond Palace. On the 9th of July 1540, her marriage to Henry VIII was declared illegal. 3 days later, Parliament granted the couple an annulment. On the 28th of July 1540, Henry VIII married his 5th wife, Catherine Howard. On the very same day, the man who had brokered the marriage of Anne of Cleves to Henry VIII, his long-time adviser and friend, Thomas Cromwell, was put to death. By the time of his 5th marriage, Anne had completely submitted to her former husband. She willingly accepted the annulment of their marriage. And Henry, mollified that he had at last found a woman who would do exactly what he wanted, rewarded her handsomely. She was given a pension and many fine houses, including Richmond Palace, Bletchley Manor, and later the family home of Anne Boleyn, Hever Castle. As a further act of his gratitude for her compliance, Henry determined that he would refer to her henceforth as his own sister. She would have precedence over every woman in England, excluding, of course, his wife and daughters. Anne had been wonderfully pliant. In fact, she was welcomed back to court as well. She spent time with the newlywed couple, with Henry VIII and his new bride, Catherine Howard. It is said that on occasions she and Catherine Howard danced together before the king. The former queen and the new queen, mistress and former servant, seemed to be working in concert. For once, Henry had a former wife who would do as she was told. It must have felt like a blessed relief. Anne of Cleves' easy manner and her capacity to please ensured that she is one of the great survivors of Henry's court, and indeed the Tudor dynasty. She lived out the rest of Henry's reign in comfort, security, and also honour, moving between the various houses he had given her and enjoying her pension from him. She outlived Henry and indeed all of his wives. Despite what the old children's rhyme might say, divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived, she was the true survivor, as far as I'm concerned. She saw Henry's son and heir Edward come to the throne. She was also there when Mary I ascended, and in fact she and Elizabeth occupied places of honour at the coronation. All too often, Anne of Cleves is a figure of sympathy, the ugly, slighted wife, cast aside and left in the country, never to marry, always ignored. But that simply isn't true. After her ready acceptance of her annulment from Henry VIII, she was welcomed back to court. She danced with the Queen. And for me, this is yet more evidence that she was actually rather attractive. She couldn't have been as ugly as people make out. Part of the point of the royal court, part of the way that you gain entry, is not simply by being noble. All courts require people to be an ornament, and that includes physical beauty. There is an expectation that the people of court will be beautiful, they will be skillful, they will be entertaining and witty. They have to be quadruple threats. Somebody who is repulsive looking, unless of course they are the king or the queen, is not going to get much traction at court. The king is not going to host anybody who is that repulsively ugly. He could quite simply have paid her off, sent her to the countryside and kept her there. By inviting her back to court, at least in some way, she proved to be an ornament as far as he was concerned, something that he wished to add to his court. And it doesn't seem that she had a natural aptitude at the other things that would have made her an ornament to the English court. Life in Cleves, while there was access to great scholars like Erasmus on behalf of her father, was not the same as the English court. It was not deemed fitting or meet for a young woman of noble birth to be engaged in learning foreign languages, dancing, the other flighty pastimes that made up the court of England and their entertainments. Anne had not had this education from childhood. It was not her natural skill. Rather, it was said that you would most often find her at her needle. So she isn't an ornament for court because of what she adds as a dancer, or a card player, or a linguist. So for me, it's because she is a pleasant temperament, and also not unpleasant to look at, that she finds herself welcomed back to court despite the fact that she is discarded wife, a potential source of embarrassment for Henry. Clearly, she has something to offer that means that he keeps bringing her back. But I'd love to know what you think of Anne of Cleves, her beauty or otherwise, and more generally of this video topic. So let me know in the comments section, or you can come and find me over on my social media. As always, I'll be leaving the links to my Instagram and Twitter in the description box. Follow me there and we can continue this conversation. I do hope you've enjoyed this video and found it useful. If you did, then please let me know by hitting the thumbs up. Please also subscribe to this channel And while you're there, why not hit the notification bell next to the subscribe button so that YouTube tells you when I've next uploaded. I hope you're going to have a great day, whatever you're doing, and I look forward to speaking to you all in my next video. Take care of yourselves. Bye-bye for now.